the entrepreneur who created his own currency. Imagine a man so audacious that he decided not only to challenge the financial system, but to create his own. An entrepreneur who looked at money, that symbol of power and trust that moves the world, and thought, why not invent my own? Now imagine the repercussion of that. People using notes and coins printed with the name of a single figure, accepted in markets, stores, and even in international businesses. It would be an act of genius, of madness, or of pure ambition. But here's the question you need to ask yourself. What happens when an individual decides to occupy the space reserved for governments and central banks? Is it possible for a single person to create a currency capable of rivaling the official money of a country? In this video, we're going to dive into a cinematic story full of controversies, powerful characters, and lessons about economics, trust, and power. Get ready, because understanding how someone dared to reinvent money can change the way you see every bill in your wallet. Stay until the end and subscribe to the Mundo Enriquecedor channel. The idea of creating one's own currency doesn't come out of nowhere. Throughout history, governments, kings, and even small communities have tried to shape alternative exchange systems. But when an entrepreneur decides to enter this territory, the plot takes on almost epic proportions. Our central character was a charismatic, visionary man, and at the same time, extremely pragmatic. He didn't accept being limited by the traditional rules of economics. He watched central banks printing money, controlling inflation, and deciding the course of the economy, while private companies depended on these mechanisms to survive. And that's when the question that would change his life was born. Why couldn't a company have its own currency? Upon launching his creation, the entrepreneur didn't just present a note or a metal coin. He presented a powerful idea, an alternative financial system based on the trust of his clients, partners, and employees. The bills bore symbols of his company, his vision, and even messages that evoked economic independence. For many, it was a bold marketing move. For others, a direct provocation to the state. At first, the currency only circulated within his factories, serving as a kind of bonus for employees. But it quickly surpassed the company gates. Local merchants began to accept those notes as payment, motivated by their trust in the entrepreneur and the perception that this currency had real value. The parallel economy grew silently, almost organically. In some cities, it was easier to find establishments that accepted the private currency than those that accepted official money. The impact was evident. Trust was shifting from the state to an individual. There was also a curious detail. The currency had a distinctive, almost artistic aesthetic that made it an object of desire. Collectors, investors, and curious individuals began seeking it not only for its economic value, but also for its symbolism. The entrepreneur had created something that blended finance, art, and power. Meanwhile, authorities watched with suspicion. Central banks viewed the phenomenon with discomfort, and politicians began debating how much of a threat it posed. Was the entrepreneur paving the way for a stateless economy? Or was it just another passing fad? The fact is that at that initial moment, the currency was thriving. People were enchanted by the idea of using free money, without bureaucracy, without intermediaries. The dream seemed to be just beginning. But every bold move has a price. With the growth of the private currency, the impacts began to spread in a way that was impossible to ignore. What was once seen as a market curiosity began to be perceived as a concrete threat to the official financial system. First came the political tensions. Parliamentarians publicly debated whether it was acceptable to allow an individual to concentrate so much monetary power. For many, this represented a direct affront to national sovereignty. After all, the ability to issue currency has always been considered one of the pillars of the modern state. Allowing an entrepreneur to maintain this prerogative was, for some, akin to relinquishing the government's own authority. Then came the economic pressures. Some local banks recorded a decline in deposit volumes as part of the population preferred to hold the new currency, which seemed more stable. Interestingly, even without official backing, it inspired more confidence than the national currency, which was shaken by inflationary crises and unpopular political decisions. It was a fascinating paradox. The one-man currency was outperforming the currency of an entire nation. But the conflicts did not stop at the financial field. There were legal battles, media persecutions, and even attempts to prohibit the circulation of that creation. The entrepreneur was called a dangerous visionary by some and a modern hero by others. The public was divided between admiration and fear. At this point, the currency had become a symbol of resistance against traditional systems. Groups that questioned the state's authority adopted it as a banner. For them, it was more than just a means of payment. It was an act of rebellion. With each transaction made outside the official system, a silent but powerful message was sent: we don't need you to live. The social impacts were also profound. People began to realize that the concept of money wasn't as fixed as they had imagined. If a private currency could be accepted and used, perhaps the notion of value was far more subjective than traditional teaching suggested. This realization paved the way for debates that resonate to this day, especially in the age of cryptocurrencies. However, the weight of state pressure began to prove unsustainable. Governments were not willing to cede power. What was once a silent revolution transformed into an open conflict. The currency was persecuted, restricted, and in some places banned. Yet it left an indelible mark. Proof that an individual with vision and audacity could challenge an entire system. The legacy wasn't just in the printed bills, but in the ideas awakened. And these ideas, as we shall see, would echo far beyond the life of that entrepreneur. The story of the entrepreneur who dared to create his own currency isn't just about finances. It's about power, trust, and the eternal struggle between visionary individuals and established systems. He showed the world that money isn't just paper or metal, but a collective construct based on faith and acceptance. When someone accepts a note in exchange for goods, they're saying, "I trust that this has value." What this entrepreneur proved is that this trust can be transferred from the government to an individual, from a central bank to a community, from a traditional system to something entirely new. Of course, his creation faced resistance, persecution, and even attempts at erasure. But the mark had already been left. Decades later, when cryptocurrencies emerged, many remembered that he was a precursor. After all, his currency was one of the first modern attempts to challenge the state's exclusivity over money. And here's the reflection that remains with us today. To what extent is the money we use truly safe, stable, and reliable? Could new forms of currency, digital or private, one day replace the systems we know? Or will the might of the state always prevail, stifling any bold initiative? This story shows us that every time someone challenges the system, a new path of reflection opens up. Perhaps the great legacy of this entrepreneur wasn't the currency itself, but the idea it carried. Money can be reinvented. And you, what do you think about this? If you had the chance, would you use a currency created by an entrepreneur? Or would you trust only the official system? Leave your comment, subscribe to the Enriching World channel, and don't forget to watch the other videos that explore the fascinating history of money and parallel economies. Because understanding the past is the key to deciphering the future.